Initially, I was very intimidated by admin questions, to be honest. But as I progressed through, I became more and more comfortable with the whole community, and that's how I got really, really involved in the community.
That is Narender Singh, a Salesforce developer over in Berlin and author of the ForcePanda blog. My name is Josh Burke. I'm a developer evangelist at Salesforce, and here on the Salesforce Developer Podcast, you'll hear stories and insights from developers for developers. Today, we sit down with Narender and talk about his experiences with the community and learning the platform, as well as specifically his experiences around external services. But to kick things off, let's start with the event that got him rolling, featuring former interviewee Jessica Murphy.
Yes, there are very significant ones I can distinctly remember. First one being me attending a meetup at New Delhi Developer User Group.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this session by Jessica Murphy. It was a virtual session by her. And in that session, she said a line that struck in my head. And she said that whatever you do, make sure that you put that thing on somewhere out there, because you need to put yourself on a map in order for other people to know that you exist. And that really stuck in my head. And another encounter that I had was Deepak Anand. He is one of the very active members on the success community, answering a lot of questions. He, to me, is pretty much everything I have learned. He directly has always been through the whole journey, and I have learned a lot indirectly, mostly because
Mm-hmm.
I value time. I know people are busy. So, but his answers, the way he approached his answer, I used to look at his answers and what was his approach to solving a problem. So, yeah.
Nice. And like after some of these encounters, like, Jessica talking about putting herself out there, how did you follow up with that? And do you feel like it impacted your career?
Yeah, so the immediate thing that really came to my mind is when I was answering a lot of questions, and let's say when I was about to research a bit on an answer that I didn't know about, I used to Google it a lot, and for some questions I eventually realized that there is no single source of information which can somebody refer to for these
Mm-hmm.
type of answers. And why not just do a blog on it, and that way people can actually refer this single link instead of posting the whole answer. Or even I can do the same if there is some repetitive or similar questions like this. And that's how these two things came together and transformed into an idea of blogging. And that's
Gotcha.
how ForcePanda came into the picture. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, well, so let's get a little technical and talk about your work around external services. First, what are external services?
So external services is essentially a declarative tool, or I would say low-code tool, not
Mm-hmm.
exactly declarative, which allows you to make callouts without writing any apex.
And call outs to like random REST APIs.
Yes, specifically REST APIs, because external services as of now, they do not support SOAP-based
Gotcha.
APIs, but only REST.
And what are some examples of REST APIs that some people might want to connect to using this?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of modern APIs are REST-based. So you have Salesforce API, for example, which is a REST-based API. You have WordPress, you have a lot. That's the thing of having a lot of APIs. You have Google APIs. Pretty much every API which you will encounter, most of them will be REST-based APIs.
So, okay, let's take that up one layer. Like, what's a use case that involves both Salesforce and a REST API that would be something that might be meaningful to somebody?
Yeah, absolutely. So as your system grows, as if you are owning a business, you will eventually realize that you need to have multiple platforms interacting together in order to make the business useful, or basically run the business successfully. So you could have a payment gateway or inventory which is residing out of Salesforce, and then you need to have a interaction between both these platforms. So in order to do that, we need some kind of connectivity, and that's where the concept of integration and callouts come into the picture. And again, as we discussed, there are two kind of APIs, REST and SOAP, and most of them are based on REST in the modern era.
Gotcha. And what's the role in creating a schema in order to get an external service up and running?
Yes, so this is the tricky part, which a lot of folks might actually struggle with, because this is something which we might not have encountered if we are new to the whole IT, if you do not have that much experience around IT. So what essentially the Swagger schema is, it's basically a set of guidelines, it's a set of protocols that you kind of follow in order to write a JSON formatted definition of a REST API.
Got it. For the unfamiliar, what is Swagger?
Swagger is specifically a tool that allows you to write API specifications for a REST API. And just like Swagger, we also have Interagent Hyper Schema as well, which is another tool that allows you to write API specifications in JSON format for a given REST API, REST-based API.
And so if you're using Swagger, or I can't remember, what was it again? Interaction what?
Interagent Hyper Schema.
Interagent.
Yes.
Interagent Hyper Schema. If we're using these tools, then we have a good JSON format for external services.
Yes. So basically, they have certain API specifications. They tell you that if you want to define a body, or if you want to define a callout, or if you want to define an endpoint, you need to use this keyword with this value, and then that's how you can approach the designing of an API.
Got it. Any advice on generating a good schema?
Yes. First of all, what you really need to understand is the constraint that comes with external services. You can have a really, really long schema, but you can only have 200,000 characters in an external service schema. So make sure that every word that you write is making sense and has some real significance in your schema, because if you are writing up a schema which is really big, which has a lot of words, then you cannot afford to have multiple lines of description, for example, for every parameter in the query could be. So yeah, one more important thing is you can also use editor.swagger.io in order to write your schemas fast, and you can at the same time at the runtime you can just verify your schema as well. So that's a good practice to actually have your schema verified beforehand, before you just go in and put the schema inside an external service.
Nice. And is there anything specific? Because at the end of the day, this is getting lined up with Apex, right?
Yes. Essentially, what happens, from what I understand, is they generate Apex classes based on the definition of your schema.
And is there anything specifically in that schema that might break Apex if something goes wrong?
Yes, there are certain caveats to this. I recently discovered, and this is a known issue, and it's quite a disappointing one. So, for example, you have in your Swagger schema, if you have a query parameter, let's say date, so if you will have to define a query parameter as date in your schema. But what happens when you register this schema inside Salesforce is that Salesforce, since date is a reserved keyword in Apex, so Salesforce will automatically rename this particular date parameter to Z0 date. And now, if you want to do a callout, you cannot just provide this specific date input parameter, because what eventually is going for the callout is 0 date and not the date. So that's a big fuck up there and really, really limits the possibilities and usage of this external service. But I believe it's patched for summer 20.
Okay.
So hopefully some good news after summer 20.
Got it. Is there anything else that like you don't want to do in a schema because Apex isn't going to like it?
So you don't want to have really, really big names, because what happens is Apex classes are being generated as you register your schema. So what happens sometimes is when you start to register your schema and try to create variables in your flow, you will get an error that the identifier name is too long, and you
Oh,
will not understand that why that really happened, because Apex doesn't allow you to have, I think, more than 40 characters in a name.
got it.
Yeah, so that's a big bummer there.
So for both the fact that you can only have so much JSON and the fact that Apex doesn't like to be too verbose, keep it simple.
Yes, you have to really think about what you are writing, especially in your schema. And the naming convention, it should be as small as possible, because sometimes often what I do is I really, even my class names are so descriptive, especially the
Mm-hmm.
method names, because you don't have a limit there. They are so long, but I am eventually starting to realize the importance of having shorter names and how you can make them work with short, basically meaningful but short.
And to kind of lead into Apex being exposed in Flow and stuff like that, this all sounds extremely technical. So how admin friendly can it be?
It can be admin friendly. There are two ways to go about this for admins. If you are
Mm-hmm.
really interested in learning how to write the schema, for this you will have, there is a prerequisite that you must understand, is how the integrations work.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are really interested, then you would have to first understand that what a API is, what are the basic methods of API, how they work, what are the callouts, what are the input parameters, and all that stuff. So once you have that understanding, it's very easy to actually write the schema. But
Gotcha.
if you are not interested in knowing the nitty-gritty details of the schema, and you are more interested in just registering the schema and actually build on that, then you can simply have a developer write the schema for you, and then all the admin need to take care of is uh, create a name credential, register the schema, and then build on top of that. So all you need to do is just register them and register the schema, then reference that generated callouts or actions in your flows, and have the response processed according to your business needs.
So in essence, once you kind of get past the hurdle of the schema, you have access to a REST API in a very declarative way.
Yes, very much. So if you can just get the schema, it gets really, really easy for an admin to actually just do a bunch of stuff with the API without having to write callouts and tests.
Gotcha. And you mentioned it briefly. You talked about named credentials. How does security on the platform work if we're working against like an authenticated REST API?
Yeah. So authentication is sometimes very tricky for a lot of folks who
Mm-hmm.
do not understand a lot of authentication protocols. Initially, I used to struggle a lot as well. So most of the APIs, I mean, if you want to just play with them, you will find that it's not, the authentication is not that complicated, and you will probably even don't have, you will not have to do authentication. For example, if you do try to do a authentication with Google Cloud Vision API,
Mm-hmm.
in that case, what the API actually gives you is an API key which goes into the query. So what essentially you need to do is create a name credentials where you do not actually pass in any credentials and just say no authentication, something like that. So
Mm-hmm.
you do not need to think much about it, and all you need to do is just pass the API key in your query parameter inside your external service callout. But there are, for example, then if you take it a level up, then you have username password based authentication, which is pretty simple. In name credentials, all you have to do is just create the name credentials with your username and password, and then what and that's the beauty of it, that the platform handles the authentication by itself, and you do not need to actually do the whole authentication process and get the token and actually then get the token and put it inside your headers of your callouts to actually authenticate your requests. So that's the very big advantage that I see in terms of using name credentials, and not just in external services, but also if you are using it in Apex.
Right, because now you don't have to it's a no-code solution for an OAuth handshake, basically.
Yes, if your if your name credential actually is sufficient enough to support OAuth, so just to actually coming to one more shortcoming, what I noticed recently.
Yeah.
So I was trying to do a Twitter API integration with external services, and what I eventually realized that what we have to Twitter is actually a three-legged OAuth process, and which is currently not supported in the name credentials. But you actually see a Auth Provider set up as Twitter. So, but when I actually had a conversation with the external services PM or name credentials, I'm not sure which one. I think she was
we have a lot of PMs.
Yeah. So I was having this conversation, and I was told that that Auth Provider was essentially designed for SSO, and they never really thought of actually something like this can be used as well. So yeah, I guess they are working on it. Something we will see in future.
As a standard, it's interesting because OAuth is not all created equal. Like everybody kind of has, their own little flavors of it, it seems like.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the front end. How does Flow play into something like using external services?
So it's very simple. So if you are familiar with flows, so using an external services in a flow is very simple. All you need to do is just drag the action element from your toolbed on the left and just put it on the canvas. You search your element or the method that you want to call out, and but when you after your selection, you will see a list of inputs. If there are any in your defined schema, you will see all those inputs listed, and you can just provide the values in the input, and then you have a choice. As the flow has progressed, you can actually have manually assignment of variables, or you can just simply choose the flow to actually take care of the output, so where it will generate the variables for you. So either ways you can go about it, and that's pretty much it. That you need to define the call out. Sometimes it's where I have really struggled is defining the call out is simpler, but actually working with the response is a bit more tricky in some cases where the response is not as simple as it looks, because too many loops inside a query. Yeah. So
gotcha. Well, so first to remind, like going back to what you were saying before, this is another good reason also to keep your Apex naming short and simple so that it's a little bit more visible in Flow, right?
Yes.
And then also to kind of talk about the response itself. Are there some things that external services can handle from a REST API response, and some things that they can't, like in the structure of the response from the REST API?
Yeah. So talking about the response and going back to my caveat that I told you, that if for the reserved keywords, this applies to the responses as well, because you need to define your response in your external schema definition. So when you define the schema definition, if that keyword is also is part of a response, it gets override, or it gets renamed. So essentially you will not be able to access that particular variable or value, and you will have to just skip that part.
Gotcha. And how complex can the response be? Like, can it handle complex objects on the return?
Well, earlier it wasn't possible before enhanced external services came into the picture, but now the enhanced external services gives you the ability to actually have nested objects. I haven't really tested the complexity to what level nested objects can go to, but
Mm-hmm.
I have done about 5 levels of nested objects with
Oh,
YouTube
wow.
Data API, and it works fantastically with that. So I'm assuming it might work
You haven't
too.
been able to break it yet.
Yes. Yeah. So for nested objects, it has worked pretty well so far for all the use cases that I have tested it.
That's our show. Now, before we go, I did ask Narender about his favorite non-technical hobby, and it turns out it's not just football, it's proper football.
I love playing football. I love playing
Nice.
basketball as well, and also a bit of volleyball.
And
Yes.
of course, when you say football, you mean proper football and not what Americans
Yes.
call soccer.
Yes. Yes. Which is very confusing at times.
Thanks for listening, everybody, and thanks to Narender for the great conversation. Now, if you want to learn more about this podcast, head on over to developer.salesforce.com/podcast, where you can hear old episodes, see the show notes, and have links to your favorite podcast service. I'll talk to you next week.